You mentioned that you cannot be healthy in the absence of a long-term stable relationship.
Yeah, and you can't regulate your own behavior.
And eventually, short-term relationships will turn you Machiavellian, sociopathic, and potentially narcissistic.
Well, it depends on why you're pursuing them. Like, look, the data on this is crystal clear. There's no debate about this among serious psychologists, let's say. So there are two patterns of successful mating, let's say. Successful pursuit of sexual gratification. There's the mosquito model and the human model. The mosquito model is plenty of offspring, no investment. The human model is very small number of offspring, very high investment. Okay, so now take the humans. Now there's a distribution of humans. Some of them are low investment maters and some of them are high investment maters. So low investment would be many offspring, no investment. Okay, now you say, that's a strategy. It's a biological strategy. Okay, who are the people who utilize that strategy? They're Machiavellian, narcissistic, psychopathic, and sadistic. So, if that's what you want, and if you're naturally like that, that will be your orientation. But if you practice that, that's also what you'll become.
For a long-term healthy and stable relationship, does that have to be with like a partner, like a husband or wife or a spouse? Or could it be, say, a brother or
that's
a child?
better than nothing. There's all sorts
but
of
just something to
relationships
contend with that will always keep you in check is essentially what you're saying.
Well, and something to care for over the long run that isn't you.
Couldn't that also be, let's say, a sibling or a close friend?
Sure.
But it's just not as
we have these other
optimal
relationships, but there isn't the advantage to long-term heterosexual child-centered coupling is that it provides all those other benefits. There's a polarity between men and women that's important, a fundamental orientation that's important. If you can bring both of those viewpoints to any given situation, in all likelihood, that's more advantageous. That provides a platform for children and grandchildren, so the continuity of humanity across the generations. And the core of that's obviously the relationship between men and women. Are there ways of approximating that? Well, obviously, but there are approximations. And that doesn't mean, obviously, there are some people who have better friendships than their marriage, but that's irrelevant with regards to the main point, because we're talking about something that's an ideal. Everybody falls short of the ideal. But part of the reason you can't maintain sanity isn't in your head. Like, here's a definition of sanity. You're well enough socialized so other people can tell you when you're an idiot and you'll listen. So why is that a good solution? Well, there's a lot of other people. And if they're giving you signals all the time, all you have to do is listen. So that's a good deal for you. Now, you might think, well, that's, sanity's in my head. It's like, what makes you think you can regulate yourself? You're pretty goddamn complicated, So we regulate ourselves socially. That's why we talk to each other. It's vital.
That's so interesting. I feel like, once again, what you're saying, I feel like I'm like struck with my pride a little bit. Like, I feel like I can regulate myself. I can always aim up or try to do what is right and think, well, I guess I'm still basing my decision-making, because a heuristic I use a lot of the time when I'm trying to decide what to do between like a moral conundrum is like, what would the optimal person in this situation do? And completely remove myself from this situation. And then I do that. But I guess that's also relating.
Well, that's right.
Yeah,
that's
being
what you've
impressed
done.
upon
Well,
by
that's right. What you've done to some, that's a good observation. What you've done to some degree is you've constructed an idealized representation of another, or a human being for that matter. That's like the Son of Man in the Christian conception. That's a good way of thinking about it. So what you're doing when you do that is no different from what, say, evangelical Christians do when they ask themselves, what would Jesus do? It's exactly the same thing.
And it's pulled from real people. It's just certain components about them.
Yeah,
so they're still technically
parts.
impressing upon me.
Yeah. You're essentially fabricating out of whole cloth something approximating a classic religious orientation. What would someone who is ideal do in this situation? Well, see, if you delved into that, this is where the religious investigation would take place. It's like, okay, who is this ideal that you're calling upon? What's the characterization of that ideal? You could write that all down. You'd see what what your ideal is. And then you'd see that it approximates the figure of the hero in mythology, insofar as it has any utility to you.
I told my friend this, and he said that is the start of religion, or that is God to people, which...
Yeah, well, that's the intermediary figure
Yeah.
in some ways. So there's the transcendent ultimate unity, let's say, but that's ineffable. It's difficult to establish a relationship with. There's some intermediary figure. That's the role that Christ plays in Christianity, right? That's God brought down to earth. Why is Christ an ideal? Because he welcomes the catastrophe of fate. Right. And so there's no ideal person who doesn't do that. I mean, James Bond does that. Like, well, seriously, like anybody that attracts your admiration is going to have that welcoming attitude towards even the difficulties of existence. Like, that's going to be a stellar part of their character. Otherwise, you wouldn't admire them. You admire people who can maintain themselves across a catastrophe. Right. So the most admirable person is the person who can maintain themselves the best across the worst possible catastrophe. Right. And so that'll be lurking at the back of the ideal.
So welcoming suffering and welcoming the catastrophe reminds me of Man's Search for Meaning, which for me was one of the most important books I've ever read. And he also quoted a man who has a why can bear almost any how. Right. Which is what you quoted earlier, which is really interesting. Are there any other books or authors where if you were to tell the viewers right now, if they started listening to them or reading them, that would make one of the biggest impacts that they can possibly?
Well, that's a good one. Modern Man's Search for a Soul. That's Jung's book. That's a very good book. The Gulag Archipelago is like Viktor Frankl on steroids.
Yeah.
But it's a voyage, that book. Frankl's book has the advantage of being pretty accessible. It's accessible, but it's profound. It's relatively short. So that's a pretty good deal. Notes from Underground, anything Dostoevsky wrote. Beyond Good and Evil, although that's a rough one. That's hard on people, that book. But Viktor Frankl's book is singular in some ways in the popular literature because of its combination of depth and accessibility. So
I read Crime and Punishment because of you. And this was the first book I've ever read of that type that was so deep. And it's interesting because now it reminds me of the conversation we had earlier where the emotions that they can bring out in the reader are so gut-wrenching. And it's like pain, but it's positive and negative at the exact same time.
That's right.
And
just like classical music, great classical music.
But it was a whole different set of emotions I feel like I hadn't experienced before. And I found that interesting because I guess overall, there was a lot of meaning in the book.
Right.
And it brought about, a different experience of life I hadn't previously experienced. But at the same time, it was the contending of like the positive and negative emotions. And also, I mean, the way that Dostoevsky can write is so descriptive and accurate.
Well, it's also a great adventure story, a great thriller, a great crime novel. It's an amazing book.